You are listening to the Cycling Podcast with Lionel Birnie, Daniel Friebe and Richard Moore.
Hello, my name's Richard Moore. I'm joined this week by Daniel Friebe. Daniele Frieberancini. Come stai?
Hello,
Where are
Richard.
you this week, Daniel?
I'm in Acapulco this week. Cliff diving? No, not cliff diving.
Tempted to
Just
break
in
into song at this point, but I won't.
Napalm's been going loco in Slovenia, hasn't he?
Yeah, he's missing.
But no, I'm actually in. I say Acapulco. The meeting room is called Acapulco, but I'm in Berlin.
In Berlin.
Did Napalm manage to squeeze in a jump in Slovenia, a ski jump?
Well, I don't think so because I heard from him this morning. He is in Slovenia on a mission for the Cycling Podcast and for friends of the Cycling Podcast. We'll hear the fruits of that trip soon. But yeah, he's having an interesting time out there. He met a couple of people, and I think we'll hear a little bit of his postcard from Slovenia next week, and then a friend special will follow. I think he's enjoyed it though. Obviously, the food featured quite prominently in his sort of report from Slovenia, but he's had a good time. You ever been to Slovenia?
I have. I've written about a couple of climbs in Slovenia for in the books I wrote about mountains, Mountain High and Mountain Higher. Absolutely gorgeous part of the world, particularly the section of Slovenia just over the Italian border, the Julian Alps, that mountain range, the Pass of Rizik. That's probably pronounced wrong, but it's sort of a famous cobbled climb, which actually was the inspiration for the numbered hairpins at Alpe d'Huez.
I kind of know the answer to this question, but it would obviously...
What do you mean? It wasn't a question?
No, the question
you're about to ask one.
But it would obviously have made more sense for the Giro to take that route back into Italy, no?
It would have been a fair old way. I mean, we were looking at Giro logistics this week, weren't we? And so from the end of the third stage in Hungary, the closest major airport is Zagreb, which is obviously in the north of Croatia. Yeah, you're right, actually, Rich. It might have done. That would have led to... I mean, Slovenia is a pretty mountainous place. If there had been a mountain stage early on, it would have been a bit like the sort of 2009 Giro, the kind of upside-down Giro that no one really was very enamoured with. I didn't mind it. I thought it was quite an interesting route. But yeah, mountain stage early on, which of course we're going to see at the Tour de France this year, aren't we? A very mountainous first week at the Tour de France.
Indeed. Well, Daniel, let's without Lionel here to do the news roundup, it has fallen upon me to do that, unfortunately. And there's a lot of news, isn't there? A lot of racing. I've been sitting watching the Saudi Tour this morning, first stage of the first edition of that race. A little bit disappointing, maybe. The field, it's an ASO race, but only 4 World Tour teams, I think. Stage was won by Rui Costa. A lot of work done by Bahrain, McLaren, and Henrik Hausler went very close. Did a very good ride by him. He was second on the stage, but Rui Costa was winner for UAE Team Emirates. But elsewhere in Argentina, the Vuelta a San Juan finished with Remco Evenepoel, the overall winner after winning the time trial in stage 3. That was 15.5 kilometers, and he was 32 seconds up on Filippo Ganna, the Team Ineos rider, and the 4-kilometer world record holder, with Oscar Sevilla third. Now, Evenepoel is 20 and Ganna is 23. Add their ages together and you get 43-year-old Oscar Sevilla. And it finished on GC that way too, with those 3 in the top 3 places, and Brandon McNulty of UAE Team Emirates fourth.
Sevilla, Rich, who I've noticed again, not for the first time, has been speaking to the Spanish press about his great relationship with Egan Bernal and how they train a lot together, which...
Well, yeah, I mean, he lives in Colombia, obviously, and trains with quite a lot of the Colombian riders, I think.
I think he does, yeah. But he's been a regular training partner of Bernal's for a few years now.
And a checkered history, of course. He was caught up in Operation Puerto all those years ago. 14 years ago now? Extraordinary. Anyway, after the time trial, there were 2 stage wins for Fernando Gaviria, who looked very good. One for Miguel Flores and one for Zdenek Stybar. Sam Bennett won the race Torquay in Australia ahead of Giacomo Nizzolo. And Brodie Chapman of FDJ won the women's race in front of another Australian, Emily Herfos. In the Majorca Challenge, there were wins for Emmanuel Buchmann of Bora Hansgrohe, Marc Soler of Movistar, and we'll be hearing a lot more about Movistar in this episode. And
Buchmann, 2020 Tour winner?
Well, he looked good, didn't he? And he I think he rode well in Majorca last year as well, didn't he, Buchmann? But he did look good, and
it's a bit of a favourite of mine. If you
a dark horse, isn't he?
Guiltily admit he's a bit of a sort of a successor, one of the successors to Pavel Tonkov in my affections. I think if I was a fan, which we're not supposed to be fans, we're journalists, but
well, you're certainly a fan of Tonkov.
Got a lot of time for old Manny Buchmann.
Yeah, because he's so monosyllabic. Is that? I know that's
nothing to do with that, Richard. Anyway, I think he's going to surprise some people this year.
Oh yeah,
I mean, he already had an excellent year last year.
Yeah, no, he's very strong. Matteo Moschetti of Trek Segafredo won 2 of the races in Majorca as well. They're 4 one-day races in Majorca. Sergio Higuita of EF is a new Colombian road race champion. Egan Bernal, the Tour de France champion, had a very nasty high-speed crash. So did his Ineos teammate Ivan Sosa, but Bernal was okay and in fact finished second in the race. Sosa broke a finger and is out of the Tour Colombia, which starts soon. Back in Australia, Leanne Lippert of Team Sunweb won the women's Cadel Evans Great Ocean Road Race, and Dries Devenins of De Koning Quick Step sprang a bit of a surprise in the men's. He got away with Pavel Sivakov of Ineos and outsprinted him to win. Quite unusual. It was a cracking race, that actually. Did you see any of that? Crosswinds, splits?
I saw the closing sort of kilometres. Sivakov didn't look like someone who's necessarily the best guy to have in that sort of finish in a sprint finish.
Well, he's the best guy to be with, maybe.
Yes.
Sorry, I know Pavel Sivakov actually listens to the podcast, so better be careful. I mean, it was a very strong ride by him, we should say. He's a great talent, and not the sort of race you would sort of tip him for. His talents lie in probably stage racing, certainly. But Devenins, 36 years old, former classmate of a friend of the podcast, Jan-Peter de Vlieger. They studied sports science together.
Used to live, I don't know whether this is still the case, but used to live on the Eau de Quaremont.
Is that right?
In the village, which I think the village is actually called Quaremont, isn't it? Which is like a little sort of artists' colony. A lot of artists living there, and Dries Devenins.
Yeah, and Jan-Peter de Vlieger, he writes for Het Nieuwsblad and has been on the podcast a few times, of course. In France, the Grand Prix Cycliste La Marseillaise was won by Benoit Cosnefroy of AG2R, ahead of Valentin Madouas of Groupama FDJ.
Famously cursed, that race. Much in the same way the rainbow jersey is supposedly cursed. The winner of La Marseillaise is supposed to be cursed for the next 12 months. Hope that's not the case.
Is that right? I didn't know that story.
And Francois would know about this, of course. Francois Thomazeau, hailing from Marseille.
Yeah, well, don't look out for Benoit Cosnefroy for the rest of the season. In cyclocross, Mathieu van der Poel won his 3rd senior men's title. It led from start to finish. Tom Pidcock took a very strong silver medal, minute and 20 seconds back, with Toon Arts the bronze medal. In the women's race, Celine Alvarado won a 3-way Dutch battle ahead of Anne-Marie Vorst and Lucinda Brand. We'll have more on this and on the winner in next week's cycling podcast, Femina. Vasil Kirienka, the veteran Belarusian Team Ineos, has retired. He had a heart condition that put him out of action for a bit of time last season, and on medical advice, he has now called it quits. Cameron Worth. Is that correct? The correct pronunciation? Cameron Worth. It sounds like something a dog might say. But he is 36 years old, an Australian rider, been around many teams and is a triathlete as well. And he is a surprise replacement for Kirienka. Is he a surprise, Daniel?
A surprise in the sense that, well, he's had a very interesting career path, Cameron Worth. He started off, or his sort of first stop in his sporting journey was, rowing, and he became an Olympic rower, then rowed as a professional in various different teams, various different countries, and retired a few years ago, and has been doing triathlons, but also been training a lot in the last couple of years with Chris Froome. And there was a sort of relationship that was built up between Cameron Worth and the Team Sky coach Tim Kerrison, which, after a couple of years has led to him being recruited by them. I don't know how much or to what extent he's seen as a replacement for Kirienka, similar sort of rider, I would suggest, someone who can probably do a lot of kilometres on the front on flatter days.
And Kirienka, I would imagine, bound to turn up on your television screens as a pundit or something,
or possibly on a podcast. I wouldn't be surprised if he launched his own pod. Would you, Ray?
Well, have you interviewed Kirienka? I tried to interview him.
I don't think anyone has interviewed. I've requested. I have requested interviews with Kirienka. One of the reasons was that there was this fascinating story, and it was completely incorrect. But it was written in the Italian press, I think, after one of his stage wins in the Giro. I think he won 2 or 3 stages in the Giro in the course of his career. And there was a story of great tragedy that his whole family pretty much, or a couple of generations of his family had been almost wiped out by cancer, which was caused by the Chernobyl disaster, because he hails from Belarus, and the exact town that he's from is not very far from the site of the disaster. And anyway, in this story, it said there were at least 2 or 3 relatives that had been affected by cancer caused by Chernobyl. And this was obviously, quite alarming and intriguing, and various journalists tried to follow up on this and put it to Kirienka. I don't know whether he actually answered the question directly. That would be unusual for Kirienka, but it was completely untrue.
Well, I did. He did agree to an interview with me once at the Giro one morning. I think it was towards the end of the Giro a couple of years ago. I said, "Hi, Vasil, any chance of an interview?" And he said, "Yes, in Russian." so it didn't happen. But we do know, thanks to Joe Dombrowski, who shared a room with him at Team Sky, that he likes to spend his evenings watching cat videos on YouTube. He caught him chuckling one evening on his bed, watching something on his laptop, and when he checked out what it was, Joe was shocked and alarmed and surprised to find that Kirienka was watching cat videos. So that was a surprise. More seriously, Danish and Norwegian media reported at the weekend that Jakob Fuglsang and Alexei Lutsenko have been apparently working with Dr. Michele Ferrari, who is, of course, banned for life, and any rider caught working with him or even talking to him is subject to a doping sanction. This story apparently came from an investigation by the CADF, the sort of independent anti-doping body that was set up by the UCI, who this body, in another development, is going to disappear at the end of 2020. It's a story we discussed towards the end of last year when David Lapartillon announced a review of the CADF with a view to possibly moving responsibility for anti-doping in cycling to the International Testing Agency, which is quite a new body and looks after anti-doping across lots of Olympic sports. It's been remarkably quick, this review, and apparently it's been concluded, and the UCI Management Committee agreed last week to close the CADF or to fold them into the ITA, which has very close links with the IOC as well. And we'll probably follow up on that a little bit more in the coming weeks because it could be quite a significant development. But the story concerning Fuglsang, and it seems difficult to separate the leak of this story with this news about the CADF in a way. But it's a very strange one, isn't it, Daniel? With lots of strands to it. It involves the Astana team, which has been subject to many kind of rumours and stories over the years, including alleged links with Dr. Ferrari, which have been unproven. But Fuglsang, of course, had this remarkable season last year. He won Liège-Bastogne-Liège. He was up there in lots of week-long stage races and one-day races, and at quite a relatively old age, 34. So for a lot of people, the story that he was working with Ferrari might have confirmed some suspicions they had. On the other hand, some of the details in this story appear slightly incredible, such as Fuglsang meeting with Ferrari in Monaco, motor pacing behind him around Monaco, where lots of professional cyclists live and train, of course, down the south of France. The investigation itself does seem credible, that based on whistleblowers and tip-offs, the CADF has been looking into Fuglsang and Lutsenko, and perhaps other riders at Astana as well. But, what have you made of what we've learned so far?
Well, Rich, I was struck by... so Michele Ferrari issued a statement yesterday. Before Fuglsang and Lutsenko, they issued a statement in the evening, but earlier in the day, Ferrari had put something on his website, just a few sort of bullet points, a bit of a takedown of the allegations. He said he hadn't been to Monaco or Nice for 12 years. He's never been on a scooter or motorbike in his entire life. Have you ever been on a scooter or motorbike?
Yeah,
Rich?
I have, but that doesn't mean that I'm guilty of any kind of dodgy behaviour.
He's never been to Lugano. That was a place that was mentioned in the story. But I've noticed people already sort of looking at the statement through a magnifying glass and already sort of picking apart certain things that Ferrari says. I haven't been to Monaco, Nice for at least 12 years. Well, there was a police investigation conducted out of Padova in Italy in 2000. Most of the information they gathered regarded the period of sort of 2010, 2011. And the Padova police certainly believed that they had traced Michele Ferrari to the Monaco area in 2010. They believed that he was seeing Astana athletes back then. I don't think there's really been any dispute that his son Stefano Ferrari was in that period working with him, and he was definitely based in Monaco or the Monaco area in that period. 2010. That's only it's 10 years ago, not 12 years ago, as Ferrari said. So that's inaccurate straight away. But one thing, just looking back at that investigation, and there were hundreds of pages of phone transcripts. The Padova police tapped Ferrari's phones. Even back then, 10 years ago, it was striking how careful Ferrari and his son were in their communication. It obviously wasn't the first time that they'd been sort of under police surveillance, and they had a very sort of practiced way of communicating with each other, so as not to incriminate themselves. So the idea that Michele Ferrari was out on public roads on a scooter in an area densely populated with professional riders and people who probably would have recognised him stretches the bounds of my belief anyway.
Yeah, and it was also claimed that he was with the Astana team at the Tour of Catalonia last year as well. One thing we can be pretty sure of is that no photographs will emerge of Ferrari on a scooter, because only one photograph exists of him, I think, doesn't it? It's the one that we keep seeing again and again.
Well, you say that, Rich. I was actually reminded, I was speaking to some Italian colleagues earlier today, and there's still a lawsuit going on, and I'm not sure what stage it's at, but about the allegation made by La Gazzetta dello Sport 4 or 5 years ago. They claimed that they had photographed Ferrari at an Astana training camp back then. He disputed that, and that dispute, a legal dispute, is still going on.
Yeah, that I do remember. And again, there were claims that the Gazzetta had a photograph but didn't publish the photograph of Ferrari at this Astana camp, which was very odd indeed. And as I said earlier, the investigation by the CADF into Fuglsang, Lutsenko and Astana seems to be based on, claims made by 12 people who have sort of dobbed Fuglsang in. So it's intelligence based rather than, I suppose, evidence based, if you like, or it certainly was at the outset, which is interesting and certainly, as you say, surprising if any rider met with Ferrari in Monaco itself. Certainly taking a huge risk, because that alone would be enough to incur a doping violation, I would think. But Daniel, one of his other claims in his statement, which was very, didn't waste any words, did it? Ferrari's statement, straight to the point. But he did also say that he hadn't been at a professional bike race since 1994, when he worked for Guist, didn't he, in 94? And it doesn't mean a lot, that, because we know obviously that his involvement with the sport didn't stop in 1994. But you and Lionel went to visit him, didn't you, when the Giro went to Ferrara last year, or 2018?
We doorstepped him, and we went to his house, which is just on the outskirts of Ferrara, and we unfortunately just missed him. We spoke to his wife, who told us she wasn't interested particularly in talking to us, and they weren't interested in the Giro d'Italia, which was leaving Ferrara that day. But she also said that we'd missed him by a couple of minutes, and we then realised that we had actually seen Michele Ferrari, because we'd seen a cyclist ride out of his front gate on a Bianchi bike, I seem to recall, and head off. But yeah, unfortunately, we never got to speak to him.
In Astana kit?
No, I don't think it was in the Astana kit.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport, fueled by science.
Thank you very much to Science in Sport for their continuing support of the Cycling Podcast, and you can get 25% off your Science in Sport sports nutrition products at scienceinsport.com with the code SISCP25. That's SISCP25. We mentioned the story concerning, in particular, Jakob Fuglsang in the end of the last part. We will keep an eye on that and return to that, I'm sure, next week as more details come out, as perhaps Fuglsang addresses some of the claims in a bit more detail. But we're going to turn our attention this week to Movistar, because this is a subject that we've been talking about for a few weeks, Daniel. A team that has such a strong Spanish identity and tradition and history, but appears almost like a different team in 2020. They've got 14 new riders. That's half the team. An awful lot of very young riders, not just young riders, but very young riders. 2 20-year-olds, 2 21-year-olds, 3 22-year-olds, a 23-year-old. That's Gabriel Cullig, the British rider, who's really a classics rider and a sprinter. We'll hear from him in a bit, but we're going to hear from Eusebio Unzue, the main man for 40 years at Movistar. They celebrated their 40th anniversary last year. And you spoke to him recently, Daniel. We'll also hear from his son, Sebastian Unzue, who is taking on a more important role within the team. And I think perhaps he's quite influential too in making the team more international. They've got a spread of riders from, Scandinavia, America, as well as the Spaniards and Colombians and South Americans that they've always had. But it's a real reboot for this team, this institution. And I mentioned you spoke to Unzue recently. He's cut from different cloth to some of the other sort of team bosses. I'm thinking of Patrick Lefevere and people like that. He seems like a very gentle, kind of avuncular figure from the outside anyway. And I don't know if that... I know you always enjoy talking to him, Daniel.
Well, I think he's quite similar to Lefevere in a lot of ways. In that he's very charming, very much seems to enjoy his sort of interactions with the media. He's also been criticised at times over the last few years as representing sort of old school, the old guard, with everything that kind of might entail. But particularly towards the back end of last year, I had a number of conversations with him about this sort of regeneration, this reboot that the team was going to undergo, and in particular the loss of the team's talisman, Quintana, who's really given Movistar, or he's been the focal point for the team's identity over the past few years. As time went on, the two parties, Movistar and Quintana, seemed to sort of gradually fall out of love with each other. So when I did sit down with Eusebio, we started with that. We started with Quintana, and we sort of looked back first on the positive legacy of Quintana. Of course, he won the Vuelta, he won the Giro with Movistar. And I asked Eusebio what his legacy would be at Movistar, but also maybe in what respects Quintana was misunderstood and maligned, and where Quintana maybe went wrong in the last 2 or 3 years with Movistar.
For us, Nairo has been very important because Telefónica and Movistar have a presence throughout Latin America, and Nairo was a kind of talisman for them. He was the guy who really brought cycling to the masses and gave the sport the popularity it's now enjoying in Colombia and Latin America, with the help of the media. So yes, he's become a Latin American icon, which for us has been very important. He's taken Colombia back to the top of the cycling world, and by doing that, inspired a generation of Nairitos. These kids who were 15, 16 years old 8 or 9 years ago when Nairo burst onto the scene. And you're now seeing that Nairo became a major personality in many Latin American countries. That's a great source of pride for Movistar and Telefónica, and for me personally. Seeing this sport and Nairo as the focus of the attention of all of those kids in those countries. All of that's very gratifying for me and for Telefónica. Sometimes what Nairo has lacked has been the ability to explain that he's human too, and that he can't always be on top. But people also need to understand that they're not calculators. They have good and bad days and periods when they don't feel good. And every day they're fighting against rivals who are sometimes just better than they are. That's why you have to savour the victories and be brave in defeat, because sometimes someone's better than you. Nairo is someone who's a fighter. He doesn't change, whether he's at his best or his worst, and he never lost faith in himself. He was always convinced that the next day he'd have the chance to get the better of his rivals again. Sometimes that was the case, and sometimes it wasn't.
Well, it's interesting to hear Unzué talk about Quintana's influence and hinting that his importance goes beyond his results. And I think, since 2013 when he was second at the Tour de France, he has, whether by accident or design, encouraged a wave of young Colombian riders to follow him. I mean, he's made it easier for other Colombian riders to find places on big teams, for one thing. But despite, Bernal eclipsing him by becoming the first Colombian Tour de France winner, I get the sense that Quintana remains the most important cyclist in Colombia and perhaps further in, Latin America as well. So he is somebody who cannot perhaps be judged simply by his results.
No, I think you're right, Rich, and I think from a commercial point of view, he's been hugely important for the sponsor. The group that owns Movistar is called Telefónica, and they're the second biggest corporation in Spain behind Santander, but they've also got massive interests in Latin America. And Quintana has really been, as I said, the sort of Pied Piper, the talisman for, this sort of wonderful new public as well. There's always been great passion for cycling in Colombia, but it's really been galvanized by all the success they've had over the last few years. I mean, in terms of sort of resonance on the last day of a Grand Tour, in terms of sort of crowd and euphoria and numbers and excitement, I haven't seen a last day of a Grand Tour like the 2016 Vuelta that was won by Quintana. There were a lot of Colombian immigrants in Madrid, but there were tens of thousands of Colombians in Madrid that day, and that was really quite memorable, and it really just underlined how important Quintana was for the team. But also there, Eusebio talked about this issue of communication with Quintana, and I think the more we watched him over the years, and there were isolated incidents, there were particular incidents where you could see this playing out in real time, how his communication with other members of the team wasn't probably what it should have been. There were times when he wasn't feeling good and he didn't communicate that to the team, and this led to a lot of the sort of the lampooning of Movistar's tactics at certain times in certain Grand Tours, that they would be riding on the front and Quintana would be struggling at the back. There was, I think, a breakdown in communications. There was also a breakdown in communications at various points with Quintana's entourage and his management. We've talked a reasonable amount already this year or in the last few months about this breakdown in communications between Unzué and Quintana's agent, but also the agent of a lot of other Latin American riders, the Italian Giuseppe Acquadro, and that's had a massive impact on recruitment for Movistar this year. And I think that's probably the single biggest reason why we've seen this sort of internationalization of their roster. I think Unzué would love to have more Latin American riders in the roster, but the fact is that Acquadro controls the interests of most of the top Colombian riders, and going forward that's a real problem that he has to deal with and solve.
Well, it's been probably unfairly a bit of a hobby horse of ours and others to lampoon Movistar's tactics at times, particularly when they've gone into, say, the Tour de France with their famous trident of Alejandro Valverde, Nairo Quintana and Mikel Landa. Landa, of course, has also left now, and we have, I guess, criticised Movistar's tactics at times, and you asked Unzué to explain a little bit about that as well.
I know that sometimes you can't change people's minds. I try to explain to them why certain things are happening, and we're obviously always trying to do the best for the team. In this team, we've almost always worked for Nairo because he's been our leader. But there are times when he can't do the necessary damage, and we have other riders who can. In those circumstances, you have to apply certain criteria for who gets the support and for the good of the team. When the abilities of the riders are very well matched, the race and the road have to decide, either in the mountains or the time trials. I understand that people who are watching races through patriotic glasses can find it hard to accept that logic, but they can't ignore that on the occasions when we haven't supported Nairo, it's because there's been a better option. But those differences of opinion and the criticism are unavoidable.
Well, pretty straightforward there from Unzué, and honest to admit that there have been times, as we've seen, where Quintana just hasn't had it. The success, the big success they had last year, of course, was at the Giro with Richard Carapaz, another South American from Ecuador, and another departure this winter. He's gone to Team Ineos. And there may be another departure to Ineos too in Andre Amador, who is currently homeless. I mean, he doesn't appear on any roster at the moment, but he is trying to get out of an agreement that he had with Movistar to join Team Ineos, and there's been no recent update on that situation. But yeah, Daniel, fair or unfair to criticise Movistar's tactics? I mean, is it tactics or just legs usually?
I think in a lot of cases it has been legs. Quintana, as we've said, has been this focal point for their or for the team in the Grand Tours, and by his nature, he's quite a conservative rider, well, either conservative or you might say just someone who's not particularly explosive, and has consequently, found it difficult to open up big time gaps and hold those big time gaps. And he's had more success, or he has only really been able to sort of follow his main rivals in the mountains in the major tours. And with Quintana, I always felt there was a misconception which arose very early, probably because we hadn't seen a major Colombian star for a long time, and we sort of mythologized and harked back to these days that we all imagined in the 80s, and when they first appeared on the scene, where they were these sort of firecrackers in the mountains, and they were spectacular and mercurial, and we thought that was what Quintana was going to be, and in actual fact he was never really that. But I think the image or the expectation that he would be like that or should be like that stuck. I think that's one thing. There have been times when they've ridden badly. On the final mountain stage of the Tour de France last year, Unzué himself said they rode like amateurs or schoolboys. Again, that was probably an issue of communication. Quintana perhaps didn't communicate with his teammates the way he should have done, or they didn't communicate with him in the best possible way. But then there are other times when I think they've been criticised unfairly. The famous stage to Guadalajara in the Vuelta last year, when Quintana had made the front split, and then Valverde was kind of marooned behind, and there was a certain point where they went to the front of the peloton, Movistar, and they seemed to pull behind Quintana. But there was a good reason to do it. They were trying to sort of eliminate Primoz Roglic's domestiques, but that was the kind of thing which at first glance was almost incomprehensible. And I think there have been various occasions when they've been the victim of almost this sort of meme that's been created, that their tactics are poor or lacking. And there've also been other times when they've pulled off some tactical masterstrokes. The Giro last year was certainly one of those. The way that sort of Carapaz really snuck up on the rails. No one was really paying too much attention to him in the middle week of the race, and with two fantastic moves in the Alps, he built his Giro victory. So I think it's been a bit of a mix.
And Landa there was a perfect foil as well for Carapaz, and probably important in that win. And there you've got an example of where having two leaders has worked very well. I guess, when we look back and review the last few years, there haven't been many, if any, occasions in the Grand Tours where, two out of those three have been really going well enough to contend for victory. I'm thinking the year 2018 that Simon Yates won the Vuelta, Valverde and Quintana were both up there, but really only good enough for the podium. And in fact, in the end, neither finished on the podium. But there haven't been too many occasions when they've had two riders capable of fighting for the win. That's been their big problem. But I mean, you also asked Unze about this year and the reboot of the team. What he's hoping for from some of their existing riders. Marc Soler is one in particular who I think has been a bit of a disappointment. He won Paris-Nice a couple of years ago. I think big things were expected of him. He's not really delivered. He's won now in Mallorca, which might mean that he's prepared well over the winter, and we might see the strong Marc Soler this year. Who knows? But Enric Mas is the big signing. He's come from Deceuninck Quick-Step, and he will be the guy who they expect to fill the shoes of Quintana and Landa, really. So a lot big things expected from him and needed from him, really. But you asked Unze about some of the new guys and the riders who are still around, of course, including Valverde.
I've got a lot of faith in the young guys that we're going to have and who will be on the front line in 2020. Marc Soler, Enric Mas, and I don't even want to mention Alejandro, because he's obviously getting on and his level could start dropping at any moment at age 40. But if there's something that's changed in cycling, it's that the big champions don't last forever, and every year we're seeing 3, 4 or 5 great riders emerge who have the ability to light up this sport and who can be the cornerstone of winning teams. The Froomes, the Thomases are making way for Bernal, and that team plus Jumbo-Visma with Roglic and Dumoulin will possibly be the two standout teams in the Grand Tours. But cycling also has the capacity to surprise and throw up all sorts of different scenarios.
Now, Unze, he's been doing it for 40 years. You asked him as well how much longer he'll carry on in this job.
Well, I'm 64 years old now, and there will come a day when I have to stop. I certainly still feel very lucky to head up this very important project in Spain. I almost see it as a moral obligation to ensure that Spain has a presence in this world league of cycling that we're in. That's pretty much my goal.
Interesting to hear him talk about the sort of moral obligation almost of running the team. But they are Spain's only World Tour team, and they're an important institution in Spanish cycling.
Yeah, you're right, Rich. And as I said, I do sort of wonder how much of this internationalization has sort of been forced upon them. I think Eusebio's son Sebastian speaks excellent English, and his sort of horizons and view are probably wider than the previous regimes have been, and it might work out very well for them, but I think they will want to remain very much the sort of rallying point for Spanish professional cycling, and they'll want to take the best talent, and it's also the style of race and racing that corresponds to them the best. They have this great tradition, this rich tradition of stage racing, and that's really what the Spanish public have been most interested in over the years. So I'll be very curious to observe over the next year or two how this sort of experiment of this diversifying the types of races they're focusing on and the types of riders they're focusing on those races with, how it works out.
Chute à l'arrière du peloton, Cycling Podcast Team Car at the back of the pack, please.
The voice of Seb Piquet reminds me to tell you that this week's episode of the Cycling Podcast is supported by Stitch Fix. Stitch Fix is the online personal styling service, or a way of buying clothes that you like without going near a shop and squeezing into tiny changing rooms with bundles of trousers and shirts over your arm. It's really simple. You fill in a style quiz online where you can outline your personal style and aesthetic if you have one, as well as budget, size and shape and any other quirks or foibles that you might have. A personal stylist will send you 5 items of clothing, each handpicked from their selection of 100 or so of the best European brands, which includes established names, cool emerging designers and exclusive brands. For your stylist time, you pay a styling charge of just £10, which is deducted from the cost of anything that you decide to keep. Your 5 items of clothes arrive in a box. You try on everything at home and keep what you like and send back the rest. Delivery and returns are free both ways. I've been a customer for about 6 months now and I enjoy it. I've kept about 50% of the clothes, which seems like a remarkably good hit rate. It includes clothes that I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have picked out in a shop. Get started with Stitch Fix today and support the Cycling Podcast by going to stitchfix.co.uk/cycling. That's stitchfix.co.uk/cycling.
The Cycling Podcast. For the latest news, views, and interviews from the world of professional cycling. Support our work and get exclusive episodes by becoming a friend of the Cycling Podcast. Go to thecyclingpodcast.com/subscribe.
If you've become a friend of the podcast already, thank you very much indeed. We've got a new system which is working extremely well. It makes it very easy to sign up as a friend of the podcast. We're releasing another episode for friends of the podcast this week. This is our Tour de France diaries from last year. Myself, Lionel Birnie and Francois Thomazeau reading our diaries. It's a sort of mini audio book, and that'll be available for friends of the podcast. Go to thecyclingpodcast.com/subscribe to sign up. If you, it's £15 for the basic package of the exclusive Friends specials. But if you pay a bit more, you'll get a signed copy of our book, The Grand Tour Diaries, as well. So thanks very much, everybody who has signed up. We've had our best ever start to our Friends program, so we're very grateful to you. Your support goes a long way to helping us cover races and sending Lionel to Slovenia and me to Italy in a couple of weeks. I think Lionel's off to Strade Bianche as well. I'm off to Milan San Remo. And the Spanish season, well, it started last week in Mallorca, but it really starts properly in Valencia this weekend. We've been talking about the Movistar team. We heard from Eusebio Unzue, the boss, in the last part, and we're going to hear from his son, Sebastian Unzue, who is taking a bigger role in the team. He set up the women's team a couple of years ago and seems to be becoming more important in running the men's team too. Doesn't refer to his father as dad, but as Eusebio, which I guess is understandable in the context of work and working for the same organisation. But as you said earlier, Daniel, he speaks excellent English, and that might be a factor in the team becoming more international and signing a British rider, American rider, and some Scandinavians this year. But I spoke to him last week about the big changes at Movistar this year. Here's what he said. Looking at the roster for 2020, it almost looks like a new team. you've got 14 new riders, 11 nationalities now, and 11 riders aged 25 or under. So a very young team as well. Does it feel like a new team to you?
Well, yeah, like you said, Richard, I think we've had 14 new riders this year, and many of them are also international. And like you said, many of them are also under 25. And that's a huge change for the team, but it's also important that we were able to keep all our core riders except 3 of our big leaders, which were Richard Carapaz, Nairo Quintana, and Mikel Landa, who all 3 of them have left the team, but we've been able to keep that core group of riders. That was something really important for us. So we're pretty much in a rebuilding process at the moment, and part of this rebuilding is bringing new young riders, which is something really important for us to bring new talented riders and try to start working on the long term also with those riders.
Is it a deliberate strategy to make the team more international? I'm thinking especially, you've always had a lot of South American riders, obviously, but you've now got Scandinavians, a British rider, an American rider as well. First American rider, I think, since Andy Hampsten, way back in the 90s. Is that a deliberate strategy? Is it an attempt to make the team more international?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these past 15 years, cycling has gone through so many changes, and I think we're going through a huge globalization in our sport. So for us, it was key to take that step and try to open up to different countries and different markets, and also try to bring riders from nationalities that are also interesting for our sponsors. So, like you said, until a few years ago, we've been always traditionally having South American and Spanish riders, maybe some Italians, some French riders, but now we're opening up to other countries, like you said, Scandinavia, the USA, Great Britain, and also trying to keep that interest in that our main sponsor Telefónica has in countries like Colombia, for example, or Argentina. We also got to take care of those countries and try to have riders from those nationalities. But yeah, the idea is to continue opening up to other countries and trying to globalize the team and become a more international team.
And how do you balance the need that every team has to win races in the present while also planning for the long term? You have got a lot of young riders there. How you're obviously planning for the future, but how do you balance that with the need that every sponsor and every team demands that a team does win races or has results in races? How do you get that balance right?
No, it's obviously the goal for every single team is to win races and to perform at the races, and obviously that's something that we cannot forget. And it's not easy to find the balance between, when you have so many young riders, it's complicated to try to win with those young riders. But I think that we have a few riders that are going to be key and that are going to be able to bring us some wins and presence in the most important races in the calendar. Like, for example, we cannot forget that we have Alejandro. We have new rider like Enric Mas, who's, in my opinion, one of the most talented riders of his generation, and other riders like, for instance, Marc Soler, who's been taking steps every single year, and this year in the Vuelta a España and Tour de France, last year, he proved in the Vuelta a España and Tour de France that he's more than ready to be fighting for big goals by himself. So I think those guys are obviously going to be able to take a step forward, and I believe that our new young riders will also be able to develop and progress during this year, and I'm sure that some of them will surprise us. It's obviously not going to be easy to win like we're used to, but I think I'm really positive and I'm really optimistic towards the year, and I'm sure that the results will come, and at the end we gotta keep working like we have until now, and when you're working well and with these riders that we have at the moment, there's huge talent in so many different areas. I think the results will come, and it's not something that I'm worried about. I think the main goal here is to try to work well and create a good group of riders, and the rest will come. I'm sure about that.
It's always been a team that's done very well in Grand Tours and stage races, of course. A lot of the new riders are sprinters, classics riders, time trialists. Does that signal a slight change of direction, or is the team still going to be?
I wouldn't call it a change of direction. I think what we're trying here is to become a more complete team and have a team that can actually perform at any kind of races. Until now, it's been, for example, the Cobalt Classics have not been a key objective in our past because we never had the riders and we never put enough focus to be able to perform at those races. They were never a big objective for us, but the importance of those races is increasing in the past years, and the sponsors demand and the fans demand that the team also needs to perform in those races, and that's something that for us it's also really motivating to try to start putting some more focus on races that are, let's say, kind of new for us, but we've been doing them for so many years. But I think starting last year already, we started putting a more important focus on the Cobalt Classics, for example, and this year it's gonna be the same, like you say. We've got many of the new riders are probably a different profile or a different type of rider than what we've traditionally had in the team. But I think they're really complete riders. They're riders that obviously like the classics, but I'm sure that they're gonna perform in the classics. But also, I'm sure that they're gonna become key riders for the Grand Tours, for the 1 week races, for the Ardennes, for any kind of races. So yeah, we're gonna try to put more focus on some of the races that we didn't put so much focus before, but without losing the essence and our historic way of trying to work in, or the races that we've traditionally liked, which are the Grand Tours, and it's what we are actually specialized in, and it's something that we're gonna keep doing. At the end, the Grand Tours are our specialty, and it's something that we wanna continue focusing on. But we don't wanna forget that there's also really important races during the season. We also wanna be present in those races, but we wanna be present with a good team, a strong team, and now we find ourselves with many young riders which love those kinds of races, and I'm sure they will develop and they will perform there.
There's a well publicised disagreement with the agent Giuseppe Acquadro, who did look after a lot of your riders. Has that had an influence, and will that have an influence in terms of the riders that you sign?
Obviously, you guys know that we've been working with Giuseppe for a long time. We had many of his riders these past years. We've had so many of his riders, but after this year we had many professional disagreements, and we had to stop our working relationship, and it obviously affected us, but I don't think I don't see it as a negative thing. We try to look at it as an opportunity to start working with other people, and other agencies and other agents, and that's something that for us is also an opportunity. And yeah, the time with Acquadro is our professional relationship. It's finished, it's done, and that's something that for the moment it's not going to change.
I mean, I wanted to ask you as well, Sebastian. I mean, your father has obviously been involved in running the team right from the start, 40 years. Do you have any idea? I mean, what are his plans? How long do you think he will carry on being involved, and will you one day take over from him in running the team?
No, I think Eusebio You guys know he's been here for 40 years, like you said, and I think he's gonna continue doing this his whole life until he's able to do it. He will continue, hopefully. But yeah, at the end, reality is that he's 65 years old, and at the end, at some point he's gonna start to not stop doing this, but he's gonna start taking some distance and trying to relax a little bit, because you guys know that cycling it's a sport that when you're into it, you gotta be a lot of time outside from home. It demands and it needs a lot of work and a lot of time, and it's obvious that at some point he will have to say, okay, I gotta take a step to one side, but for the moment that doesn't look like it's coming close. So we still have Eusebio for a few more years for sure.
Is he, from what you can see, is he still as enthusiastic? Does he still enjoy the job as much?
Every year he's more and more enthusiastic. We were actually meeting a few minutes before having this call with you, and we were talking about. He was telling us we were sitting down with some of our sports directors and our head of performance, Pachi Vila, and he was telling us how excited he is to start this season with so many young riders, with so many new faces, and trying to see how far we can go. And obviously he wouldn't continue doing this if he didn't still have the same passion he had on day one. So that's something that it's still the same, and he works with passion, and I think that's one of the main reasons why he's been able to go so far in cycling and to achieve so many great things, is the passion he has for this sport and the love he has for this sport. He's a guy that lives for cycling. He breathes cycling. He's cycling 24/7. So I think he's just extremely passionate about this.
And finally, Sebastian, when are we going to see Alejandro Valverde start to decline? Are there any signs? Has he been as keen as ever over winter? Are we going to see the same Valverde this year as we've seen in previous years?
I ask myself the same question so many times every year, and I have no answer for it. The only thing I can say is that Alejandro, he will stop the day that he loses the passion and the day that he stops having fun on the bike. I think his secret is that he just loves riding his bike. He loves training. He loves taking care of himself. He loves keeping himself in the right diet. He loves all those things. They're not his job. They're just his like hobbies for him. So this is what makes him, I think, the secret to his success and such a long time at this level. It's the passion he has and how much he enjoys cycling. And right now, being honest, at the moment, seeing him these past days in the training camp we had in Mallorca with some of the young riders, you see him how he looks at them, how he talks to them, how he wants to help them and try to transmit to them everything he's learned in cycling. I think we still have Alejandro for a few years.
And when he does stop, will he get in the team car? It's almost impossible to imagine the Movistar team without him. Do you imagine that he will remain involved?
Yeah, I'm sure about that. I mean, I think Alejandro will continue at least on the bike for 2 more years. I think he will be on the bike at least for 2 more years, and right after that, he's 100% sure gonna continue involved with the team. He's been someone key for our organization for so many years, and I think he's someone that we cannot have outside the team, and he's gonna provide so many positive things to us and to our riders that it would be stupid not to have him inside our organization when he stops riding his bike.
Well, we're talking about the kind of changes at Movistar, but one constant, of course, is Alejandro Valverde, who is about 52 now. No, he's homing in on his 40th birthday, and still, well, certainly last year, looked almost as strong as ever. He will go into decline at some point, but it's strange, isn't it, that for all the changes and all the young riders coming in, Valverde ensures that when we do the average age, it's still 28 something.
Yeah, Rich, and I think they will be more reliant on him than ever, in the sense that if you look at Movistar's results last year, and that particularly their race wins, if you take Valverde out of the equation, there's very little there. And you look at the number of young riders that they've brought in this year, and they're not going to be expecting many wins from those guys. So, they will expect Valverde, in spite of his advancing years, to come up with 5 or 6 or 10 race wins, but certainly be very visible and prominent in the biggest races. They also need people like Carlos Betancourt to step up. Betancourt actually, a sort of another much maligned figure. He actually had one of his better seasons for a while last year, was pretty consistent. That's been his problem for a few years now, being sort of present and correct throughout the whole season. And he was last year, rode quite a lot of races, got some decent placings in races like the Tour of Switzerland. So they need guys like him, the sort of experienced guys with the sort of a punch, explosive ability to win races, to sort of come through.
Another guy I expected more of was Carlos Verona. He joined from Michelin Scott a couple of years ago. Is that unfair? Or, he certainly looked at Michelin Scott as though he was capable of more, but he hasn't really delivered an awful lot at Movistar.
I think they've got a few riders, the likes of Cataldo as well, and Vilela, who have both come from Astana, who will sort of guarantee a certain level of quality in the major tours, and they'll be the guys who they're firing off down the road in mountain stages in major tours, and they'll be very much part of the A team. I'm not sure they'll be looking at those riders to come up with many race wins. I don't think they can, because those riders have not been used in that role at their other teams for quite a while now. But the problem I see, or the potential problem, is what's happening with the B team when the A team are off, either preparing for a major tour or racing in the World Tour. It's kind of what happens really when they're trying to blood the younger riders in maybe the sort of lesser races, how to sort of keep morale up if they're not initially able to sort of compete at the front of those races. I think and that's going to be a challenge. Like I said, I don't have too many concerns about how they're going to perform at the Tour de France, the Giro and the Vuelta, and bigger stage races like the Tour of the Basque Country. But there's an awful lot of other racing in the calendar which is going to be a challenge.
And Enric Mas, he's the guy, when he finished second at the Vuelta in 2018, it looked like he was going to emerge as the next great Spanish hope in Grand Tours. Bit of a sideways step last year, really. And I guess he might suffer from what we might call post-quick-step syndrome, where riders leave that very successful machine that is Deceuninck Quick-Step and sometimes struggle. Maybe they've benefited Deceuninck Quick-Step in ways they didn't even realise, just by virtue of having so many winning riders on the team, which creates this sort of momentum around them. But he's going from a team with packed with winners to a team that will be expecting him to take an awful lot of responsibility for results, especially in those really big races this year.
Yes, Rich, there's a lot of pressure on Enric Mas. Last year, I think it's easy to overlook or forget the fact he was actually riding a very good Tour de France. He was well inside the top 10 overall until he had one terrible day in the Pyrenees, having done a lot of work for Julian Alaphilippe, and after that, sort of in the second half of the race, was pretty much forgotten about in terms of the general classification. But that would have been a valuable experience. He then won the Tour of Guangxi, didn't he? So he's the guy really that they're looking at to to replace 3 riders, to replace Quintana, Landa, and Carapaz, and it's a huge responsibility. He's someone, I talked about Soler and the way he sort of carries himself and the kind of temperament. I don't have those same concerns. I wouldn't have those same misgivings about Mas. He's someone who strikes me as being very focused, and exactly the sort of psychological profile we're accustomed to seeing from a Grand Tour leader.
And you're absolutely right. You're right to point out about the Tour last year. He went in there as their GC man, and his role changed. And Alaphilippe was extremely grateful to him. I remember on several occasions at the end of stages for the work they'd done, some of which we don't necessarily see. But that would have changed his race completely. So let's hear from one of the young riders that they've signed, Gabriel Cullig, the British rider. Who's not the youngest on the team. He's still a young rider, but he's been around a few years. And there have been other British riders on the team, Alex Dowsett recently, and Jeremy Hunt before him. It's longer since an American was on the team. Matty Jorgensen has joined us. Andy Hampson was the last rider on that team when they were Banesto back in the 90s. But Gabriel Cullig does follow a sort of tradition there. So I spoke to him recently, just before he headed out to the Tour Down Under, in fact. So he's made his debut in Movistar colours already.
I mean, congratulations, first of all, on getting a ride with Movistar. How did it come about, the move to that team?
Yeah, it's a funny one, because as far as I was concerned from last year, it was just this time last year, Christmas last year, I did a camp with the UAE, and then around that time we pretty much agreed that I'd stagiaire with them, but that we didn't sign anything. And then, my agent Andrew McQuaid was pushing all options because I'd not signed anything. And then at the Giro, I remember him texting me saying, I've been pushing a lot of options for you, mate. Also a funny one, I had a funny chat with Movistar, which was a bit out of the blue. And then that was the last I've heard of it, for about a month. And I think Andrew decided to keep it quiet because it was I think it looked really promising, and I don't think he wanted to get my hopes up. And next thing I know, I was at European Games, and I finished the race, and he said, "Right, job done there, mate. Do you want some good news?" And I was like, "All right, go on then." And he said, "It looks like there's an offer on the table from Movistar. They just want to speak to you on the phone, and just to kind of finalise things." So and then the day I got back from Minsk, Sebastian Unzui rang me. And I had a good chat, and then he said, "Is there any rush for us to, get, is there any other teams bugging you or anything?" I said, "Well, I'm meant to be stagiating with UAE," and I was like, "Okay, we'll get back to you as soon as possible." And literally the next day, it was, the contract was agreed, and it was being written up and sent over to Andrew. So it all came about pretty fast. So.
And were you? I mean, you were surprised maybe by the identity of the team, but when did you? And in talking to Sebastian, did you get a sense of a bit of a change of direction for them? They've got an awful lot of new riders for next year, and it's a far more international team and a very young team as well.
Definitely, yeah. I think I was one of the first of the kind of international riders they spoke to, because this was June, when everything got sorted, and Seb approached Andrew at the Giro, as I said, and I think basically said, we're looking for a young classics guy who, has been kind of consistent over the last few years in under 23 racing, and I think I was at kind of the top of the list for that, with that aspect. And when I spoke to Seb on the phone, he said, "Look, we know, obviously you see a lot of young guys, really young guys, kind of stepping up to pro and being prolific early on, but they kind of they didn't want to go down that road. They wanted, obviously I've got other young guys, but they wanted to also someone who they believe has been consistent the past few years, and they can see in like 4 or 5 years being, one of the, pretty reliable as kind of a leader in the classics, because that's an area they don't specialise in, but they realise that, sponsors do want results in those races. So for them to approach me, the more I thought about it, the more I thought this is actually perfect, because I don't think there's any other team really that would get this opportunity with, in terms of the amount. Well, basically my calendar is I'm basically doing all the classics from opening weekend, and I think pretty much every other team I wasn't really getting a look in. In my first 2 Neo-Pro years, so it's perfect, really.
And what you've gone and met your new teammates. Movistar famously don't really have training camps, but you've had a get together. What was that like? What was the sort of atmosphere like when you went there?
It was so we had 2 get-togethers. We had one in Pamplona start of November. That was a week where we just did bike fitting and kit fitting and all that sort of stuff, and then a bit of team building and that, and then the camping training. The camping Calpe was a bit of a training camp. As soon as I got there, it just felt like really did feel like a family, and everyone's so welcoming. And I've been learning Spanish since I knew that since June, since I knew I was going to sign. So I had enough. I picked up enough to understand what was going on, and to be able to, not on my whole conversation in Pamplona, but I had lessons between Pamplona and Calpe, and I managed to be able to pick up a little bit, and conversate a bit. I just really felt welcome. Everyone's treated the same. There's no egos. Obviously, there's some big names there, but everyone was really friendly. There was no one not talkative or welcoming or anything. Everyone was, really, 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 really warm, and it's a really nice atmosphere. And I felt like straight away in Pamplona, I just, by the end of the week, it already felt like a big kind of family. So I couldn't have been more happy really with how that kind of welcome. So, like I said, there is older guys still like Valverde, Rojas, Imanol, VT, and that. And on my calendar at the minute, I'm down for Valencia, and there's another one. What it was, but those guys are going to be there, and that's going to be a really good opportunity to learn, that kind of learn from those kind of road captains, and learn the ways of a domestique, because I know that obviously that's what I'm going to be relied on as a bit of a strong man to drop the guys off, at the bottom of the climbs, that type of thing. So to be able to learn from those guys as well as have that mix of opportunity to win races, it's just it's really special actually, and I'm going to have to really take it with both hands, because there's not many neo-pros that get that mix of opportunity.
And I know you're a big fan of the 80s and the 90s, even though you weren't actually around then. But you must have a sense of the team's history, from the Reynolds Banesto days.
Yeah, definitely. It's nice to be a part of a team that's been around for so long. Just knowing it's secure, and there's that, like when we were in Pamplona, they had the documentary launch of the 40-year anniversary, and I knew it was Reynolds and all that, but seeing all the different jerseys over time is you realise they're like, oh yeah, that was this team, and it is pretty, it's very special to be a part of.
Rich, just looking at Colours results over the past 2 or 3 years domestically, he talked there about how they'd sort of liked his consistency, and they see him as someone who can really thrive in the classics over the next 3 or 4 years. What's your feeling? I guess it's very, very difficult to sort of transpose results on the British domestic scene to a World Tour Classics environment. Obviously now teams have a lot of sort of physiological parameters they can look at, but we saw, maybe a good example is Holmes at Lotto Soudal, who won the stage in the Tour Down Under in his first World Tour race, really having not really jumped out at the sort of talent scouts with his results in British domestic races. Always been a very sort of solid pro for a number of years, but not someone who you would immediately have said, yep, he can definitely win at World Tour level.
No, but for Cullig himself, the point he made is that he will have opportunities at Movistar that he might not have at other teams. So he will find out one way or the other, and he certainly fancies these Belgian classics that he'll get a chance in. Movistar, Sebastian Unzué said that they want to target some of these races and have a good presence in those races, but that's that's different to really having a system or a setup that truly supports success in those races. And it's always been a bit of a running joke, I suppose, that the teams that Movistar or in their previous guises have sent to the Northern Classics have been guys who on paper are suited to those races, but aren't necessarily given all the support and resources that they would need to do well in them. I do remember visiting Alex Dowsett when he was riding those races. He was pretty green in them, but he talked about the sort of ramshackle bunch of riders put together to ride those races. It might be different with the more varied squad that they have, with quite a different composition to it, but we'll find out. I mean, the only way for Gabriel Cullig to find out how he can do in these races is to ride them, and if he was on another team, he might not have the opportunity to even do that.
Yeah, he's going to be an interesting one, Rich. Just looking at the roster and the other neo-pros, the other first-year pros they've brought on, the two Colombians are the ones that really catch my attention, Einer Rubio and Juan Diego Alba. They've got a fair amount in common. They're both climbers. They were two of the Colombian trident that really dominated the Baby Giro last year. They ripped that race to shreds, the Colombians. The winner was Camilo Ardila, and he's actually gone to the UAE team. But Alba and Rubio have ended up at Movistar, two of the sort of rare Latin American talents that aren't part of the aforementioned, now infamous, as far as this podcast is concerned, Aquadros portfolio. But something else they've got in common, they're both from families of potato farmers. And Rubio, I was reading about him today. He was born, like a lot of the Colombians, very high altitude, 2,900 meters above sea level. But his family actually moved to Bogota from the countryside because there have been terrible droughts over the past 20 years or so that have really badly affected potato farming. And that sort of changed his life. But two very highly rated young climbers, Alba and Rubio, and two to look out for. They could potentially sort of step into the breach, step into the void left by Quintana in the next 2 or 3 years.
Rubio 21, and he was second at the Baby Giro. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. They've got so many of these young riders that one or two of them could really. And we've seen, obviously, in the last couple of years, and we talked earlier about Evenepoel, 20 winning in Argentina. The age thing might not be the barrier that it was, and especially in a team like Movistar, which looks and may be in some races quite leaderless. So there could well be an opportunity for some of these guys to step up. Okay, let's wrap things up for this week. Daniel, we'll be back next week with the pleasure of Lionel's company again, maybe with something of his dispatch from Slovenia as well. But we should finish off with a thanks to some of you who've signed up as friends of the podcast. So from me, a big thank you to Richard Knight, to Jody Cinnamond, to Mike Hyman, Phil Clark, Christopher Danner, Rachel Bampfield, I hope I've got that correct, Rachel, Andrew Heaney, Danielle Burke, Stephen Harris. Stephen Harris was the winner of our competition for Best Friends of the Podcast last year to guest edit an episode, and Jim Walton. And from me to Michael Joyce, Sandy Jones, Andrew Smith, Simon Morton, Ryan Davies, Chuck Hancock, Paul Barnes, Dominic Thompson, Peter Meergertz, and James Robinson. And thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much, Rich. See you next week.
You have been listening to The Cycling Podcast. Subscribe to our newsletter at thecyclingpodcast.com to get all the latest news and special offers delivered straight to your inbox. This episode was edited and produced by Tom Wally.